Well, if you can believe it, this is the 50th episode of the Effective Executive podcast and YouTube videos. And in this episode, I want to talk about lessons learned from COVID vaccines for executives. And when you look at what's been happening, we've been trying to get everybody vaccinated uh, to get over this COVID thing, and there's resistors and there's people that don't want to get it, and so I think one of the aims was to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And so I want to talk about this a little bit. And like I said, these are some lessons I think that executives can learn. Uh, what we've seen the government do is try things like mandates and forced compliance and withholding government payments for Medicaid and Medicare and executive orders and rules and all of these things fall into two major categories that executives are going to have to deal with on a daily basis: control and incentives. And uh, you know it's a focus, as I've mentioned, that organizations have on getting control and incentives, and they do it through all of the things that pretty much I just mentioned, um, in order to get what I would reference as forced compliance. And you know these things, control and incentives, I know to be an organization's leverage points for how you can make your organization run better. The probably counterintuitive thing that actually works uh, when you're dealing with employees is freedom to make your own decision. So, on the one hand, we've got forced compliance and coercion, and on the other hand, we have freedom. And when you're doing your own job, and one that at the beginning, granted, you have to get some training, you got to understand, but you're going to question a lot of the things that you're trained. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Well, at least I do. Um, and then once you learn, then there's some value that can be added to it. But the key component here is freedom to make your own decision. And so let's kind of take a look at that. There's two approaches going on here, and that's the side that basically says, well, you have to do it, and what works better all almost all the time is giving people the freedom, but also give them the knowledge. And one of the things that's been lacking in the COVID vaccine process is mixed messages. And if once you get the vaccine, you won't have to get, you'll never have to wear your mask again. And you go to the CD site and it changes on a daily basis. And none of it can be tracked back to what I see as the science of it. And the strange thing about science is no theory is ever proven. And so with science, what may be true today with the knowledge you have 3 hours later may not be. And so you run into this danger when you're trying to get a one size fits all for humans and say, no, you have to do this. And there's a lot of gray area when you get into science. I mean, ask any scientist if when they conduct an experiment and it works successfully, they give you the conditions that it works successfully in. They tell you about specific types of setups for that experiment. And that doesn't mean that the next experiment with different variables is going to have the same result. And so this is where, from a COVID standpoint, people need to be given the knowledge that the CDC has and scientists have with regards to, the efficacy of the vaccines, so that the individual has the freedom to make a decision. Now, this plays out in the organization. Once you know you have the responsibility of making the decision, then you will go out and seek the information that you need and basically assess what is best for you and your family in that case. Today, government wants to do that for you. And because they do that, and because the science changes, this is where we get into forced compliance and coercion and things of that sort. The control and incentives portion. We'll pay you $100 if you go get it. I'd rather know more about what the dangers are associated with something and make my own decision. And so when you're doing your work, you want that same freedom to make that decision. And when they know they have that responsibility, that they'll make the best decision for themselves and their family. So considering now from an executive in an organization, you get the same types of things, that you have, so many organizations and people that I'm talking to today are all about using the control and incentives more than ever. And this will give you the forced compliance through coercion, but you're not going to get people buying into what it is that you're trying to do. Giving people the freedom to make their own decisions about their own work in their own particular area gives an acceptance and not a resentment towards being coerced or forced to comply to something. And so this is what we want to achieve in organizations, is this ability for the individual participating in making decisions and innovating their work and so forth, because then they become more engaged in the organization because they're going to be responsible. And granted, you don't want somebody to jump out of a plane without a parachute, but you want people to be able to think through things and know about things like synthetic thinking or systems thinking, so that they can make better and better decisions, because anything that you throw at them at that point changes in customer tastes. Changes in the environment that they see, especially on the front line. Your organization is going to be able to react much more quickly. Whereas, executives may not do anything for months because they're waiting for the next report to come through. So how do you build that in an organization is a lot about what I do in coaching and working with executive teams. So let's play this out a little bit from a neuroscience standpoint. So some of you know, or maybe a lot of you know, that I started this podcast, and this is before even the YouTube channel component, with understanding the neuroscience of things. I had a number of people that I interviewed around neuroscience. And there are 5 things, in essence, that can compromise the thinking of an employee in an organization. Their professional standing, if they lose status within an organization, knowing what's coming next, a predictable future, freedom, which I just talked about, being socially connected to the organization, and equity and fairness, but not the equity and fairness we seem to be talking about today. And that's a whole nother episode. But people want to be treated in a fair way. So the third one, freedom, that we're talking about, becomes very important from a neuroscience standpoint, that we have the freedom to make our own decisions about what's going on in the organization. And even W. Edwards Deming talked about in his last interview the importance of freedom and having the freedom to make decisions, which will help in things like innovation. Now, I like to use this whole freedom thing as kind of the story. I'm sure many of you have probably heard it, is the wind versus the sun trying to get a coat off of a human. And the wind says, I can get that coat off him faster than the sun. And so the wind blows and blows, but the harder the wind blew, the tighter that the human basically, covered himself up and held on to their jacket. What did the sun do? The sun went out and turned up the heat. Willingly, the human takes his jacket off. And this is the kind of thinking and attitude you need to have within organizations. Is when you're doing forced compliance and coercion, you're the wind. When you're allowing people to make decisions about their own work and have freedom within the workplace and participating in it, you're the sun. So that's what I wanted to cover this week, and I will catch you later.